Hello again, this is Preheat. Welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. So in my previous video, my Augmentation Evoker guide, I went over rotations and I attempted to give you something that's kind of like a one-size-fits-all for the opener. And today what I'm going to do is give you more options because there's actually a lot of nuance to how you need to do your opener's augmentation. Obviously, it's a class that depends on other people more so than any other spec since it's support. So there are actually a lot of different ways you can approach the opener. I'm going to show you today a lot of different versions and kind of give you situations and scenarios where one version would be better than another. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. All right, let's start with a recap of the general concepts that we need to make sure that we're doing right here. So in our opener, we are going to be applying Addon Might to our allies. Before we do that, we need to make sure that we prescience whoever it is that we want to receive our Addon Might buff. We're only going to have 2 of those, and it will be removed on boss combat. So we have to do this after the polls already began. So obviously your first 2 globals are going to be just to get your prescience out. After that, we want to get our Addon Might out as well, because that's going to have a really high uptime, especially with our new 4-piece. So we want to make sure we're buffing everyone right away. And then after that, we need to make sure that we're hitting our Breath of Eons whenever our allies are at the peak of their damage. This is where things get variable, because every class that you buff is going to be different. Keep in mind, Breath of Eons only applies to the targets that you currently have Addon Mighted. So whenever you use your Breath of Eons, you're using it to apply temporal wounds to your target, your enemies, not your allies. Your allies are not getting your buff. You don't have to make sure you fly over your allies. I keep getting this question. Don't worry about that. You need to just make sure that you hit your enemies with it. And you need to make sure that you're also trying to keep it the shortest distance possible. If you do a Breath of Eons that is max range, if you make the thing go fully extended here, it's going to take longer for you to reach the end than if you had done it minimum range. And it's not going to change how effective it is. The effectiveness is going to stay the same. So you need to make sure you're doing this at the minimum range possible, unless the situation is you need to mark targets that are really far away. So last year we had an example of that with the Amalgam Chamber. Since there were 2 elementals, you want to hit both. So you had to do like a long breath to hit both. Obviously, there's exceptions to this rule. But the main thing is you just want to make sure this is the shortest distance possible. And the way this is working is we are applying temporal wounds to the enemies, is going to be accumulating damage dealt by our allies who currently have Addon Might. If we don't have any allies with Addon Might, it's just going to throw Addon Might on your nearest allies. That's not good for raid. You don't want to do that. But in Mythic Plus, it's not a big deal because you're always buffing the same people. So in M+, if you need to, you can lead with Breath and then apply your Addon Might right afterwards. Not a huge deal if you do that. Obviously in raid, it's a little different unless you have prescience already out to mark your targets who you want to buff. But anyways, so because this is a damage imp, because we're accumulating the damage, we want to make sure that we're putting as much damage into this window as possible. We also need to make sure our allies are putting as much damage into this window as possible. So this is where our mastery comes into play. So Shifting Sands is our mastery. As you can see here on my Evoker, I have 9,000 mastery. That's a lot. It's a good amount you can definitely get here. We don't even need mythic gear to get to this point. But the important thing is how it gives the versatility out. So this is going to give it to your closest ally who currently has Addon Might, and it's going to apply this buff. In my case, it's going to be 19.2 versatility. In your case, it might be different. But the duration and the strength of the versatility buff are both dependent on your mastery values. So the higher mastery, the better. This is the whole reason, well, one of the reasons why we stack mastery. But anyways, since this buff is 12.8 seconds for me, and since my Breath of Eons is lasting about 12.8 seconds, right? It's the same duration. I need to make sure that I'm overlapping these buffs as much as possible. So in any case where you are delaying your Breath of Eons, so example would be for a damage amp like on Smolderon, right? For instance, if you're ever delaying your Breath of Eons, you need to make sure that you have your Empower spells ready for whenever you apply Breath of Eons. Do not use your Empowers and then Breath a little bit later, but without Shifting Sands being up. Like you need to make sure you overlap Shifting Sands with your Breath of Eons. So if I were to not use Breath of Eons on the pole, but I were using Upheaval and Fire Breath, that would mean my Breath is going to be like over 20, 30 seconds into the pole, right? Like it's going to be long enough so that I'll be able to have my Empowers back to use them again with Breath of Eons. The main thing is you don't want to be using Breath of Eons and not having your Empowers right there with it. It needs to be all together. So here's one example of the opener. This is the one I did in the video. This is like the one size fits all option. This is if you aren't delaying your Breath of Eons at all, if you're just trying to get it out as quickly as possible. So classes that this is going to work well with are going to be classes that do a lot of damage up front that don't need to ramp into their damage. So in this case, you would begin by, obviously gaining out your buffs on the pull. But once combat has began, you're going to be buffing your 2 allies with Prescience. After that, you're going to hit the Ebb and Might into Tip the Scales Fire Breath while you're moving in, into Upheaval, and then you're going to Breath of Aeons and use your Trinket Potion as soon as you land. Okay, so in this case, I used my Empowers before Breath. Let's talk about why this may not be a good option for you. So if you are using your Empowers after Breath, you actually get them to buff your Breath of Aeons. In this case, I'm not doing that, right? I'm just sitting them beforehand because I'm trying to use it as time to get close so I can immediately go into my Breath of Aeons. So the reason I'm recommending this is because I see a lot of evokers either not pressing their Empowers fast enough after Breath of Aeons, or doing their Breath of Aeons too long, and then by the time they finally get their Empowers off, the Shifting Sands is not really overlapping with Breath of Aeons because already a third of it has gone by, or just people in general just like misplaying. This is the closest I can get to like a one-size-fits-all opener because it has a slight delay to doing your Breath of Aeons. Your Empowers and the Shifting Sands that comes from them are generally overlapping with Breath of Aeons, but it's not perfect. It's not the best one, the most min-max one. Okay, so let's say that you have a pretty good feel for augmentation, you're comfortable with it and confident in it, and you're looking at logs and you're realizing that your DPS usually take about 6 to 8 seconds to start really hitting their stride and getting into their ramp so that they're doing the highest damage possible for your Breath of Aeons. This is probably going to be the most common case for you. Okay, so we want to make sure that our Breath of Aeons is not going out right away. We want to make sure that we're delaying it. In order to do so, we need to change what we do just ever so slightly. So still get your buffs out before the pull, and then we're going to be opening with Living Flame just like before. I'm going to buff myself here twice, and I'm going to use Ebb and Might. And then in this case, I'm not going to Breath of Aeons right away. I'm actually just going to cast a couple eruptions here. And let's say that 8 seconds, 9 seconds, 10, this is about where we need to get this damage out. So I'm going to use my Trinkets after my Breath of Aeons, both Empowers, and then continue casting into it, as you can see here. So in this case, the whole idea is I am using my Empowers inside of my Breath of Aeons, but I'm making very, very sure that I do them right away. There cannot be any delay in that, or else we're going to have an issue. So this is what I recommend for most people. Like if you are confident in your abilities as augmentation, and you want to start doing even more damage, and you're looking at logs and you're seeing people are maybe holding their cooldowns just a little bit, or, it takes a little bit for them to get into their Kingsbane window or Deathmark, whatever it is, right? Whatever class it is that's having these issues ramping or taking extra time to ramp into their damage. This is going to be how you get the most damage out of their Breath of Aeons. Okay, so you notice in that example, I delayed my Breath of Aeons, and I delayed it for a good while. It went out about 10 seconds into the pull. So this is like an extreme example of how much you might delay if you're still using it on the pull. The amount you want to delay it by is going to depend on your raid. So I'm going to show you a heroic log to give you an idea of when I would use it if I was looking at this and trying to min-max my damage. So the first thing I would do is determine who I'm actually buffing. So this is not root heroic. I already have a pretty good idea of who I'd buff, but I'm just going to walk you through the process. So I click damage done and I select the first minute of the fight right away. And then looking at right here, I can see, okay, it looks like the Devastation Evoker, Preheat. Yeah, he's doing pretty good. I would probably buff this guy. And then also the Rogue is a great option here. BM Hunter, Demon Hunter. This is what I keep saying, right? Like the best targets to buff, generally speaking, Rogues, Hunters, Demon Hunters, Devastation, if there's even one in the raid, if they exist. Usually they're pretty good if they're good at pressing their buttons. But that's the general idea. Okay, so I have my targets here, and I'm like, okay, I know these are the targets I want to buff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take their damage, and I'm going to break it out into this little side chart by clicking the plus signs here. Once I have my target selected here, I'm going to decrease the size of this window down so I can try and get a better feel for exactly when I want to get this damage amp out. So I'm going to reduce this to about, let's say 30 seconds. Okay. So right here, I can kind of see how the raid's DPS looks as a whole, and I can also look at the DPS of my allies here. In the case of our rogue, it looks like their damage starts kind of going out at about 5 seconds, and then it keeps going up here at about 16, and then it goes back down. So the window that I'm looking for is a 12-second window where I can get the most damage possible out of these four. So let me go ahead and choose filter on this, so that it then filters out our below chart. Okay, so now we have all of these combined into one nifty little chart, and I need to find the window on the opener that's going to give me the most damage possible. So it's pretty obvious, right? Like right here at 5 seconds, this is where things start really taking off and things stay pretty high. And it does have some, you know, ebb and flow to it, but you know, it will eventually go back down. I think if I were to just grab a 12-second window, I would probably try to grab here from 5 seconds all the way out to 17 seconds. This is probably going to give me the best damage total. So in here, we have 25 million damage, right? If I look at this specific window, we can always go back and do that again. So maybe I want to start it at 8 seconds instead. And then that'll come out to 20 seconds. And we're at 23 million in that case, right? So you can play around with this if you want. I mean, I don't really recommend sitting here and just looking at this all day because you could definitely waste your whole day looking at this. I would just try to grab it like where it begins, like this little first peak. So that first peak is when your Breath of Aeons needs to make contact with your targets. And notice here that Devastation is not really doing a whole lot of damage in this specific window. That's because Devastation has to ramp into their damage. So this is probably a little bit too early for the Devastation Evoker, but they're still a pretty good buff target. So maybe I would try to stay on top of them whenever I give out my Ebb and Might instead of using Prescience on them, because I want to make absolutely sure that I am buffing the rogue. I want to make sure the rogue's damage is in this window. So with the 6 seconds in mind, I want to basically run through the opener again just to practice it, to try and get it to be where I'd want it to be for my raid comp. So in this case, I'm going to pre-buff everything like I do beforehand. Obviously not using Prescience or Ebb and Might though. Those reset on combat. And then let's say the boss is about to begin the encounter. So I'm going to go ahead and use my Living Flame. I'm going to throw out my 2 Prescience into the Ebb and Might. And then right here at about 6 seconds, this is where I'm going to use my Breath of Aeons, use my Trinket Potion, hit that tip the scales on the Fire Breath, and then the Upheaval, just like before. And from there, it's the same rotation, right? I'm just trying to make sure that I maintain my Ebb and Might as long as possible while throwing out my Prescience on whichever targets I want to be buffing. So that would obviously be the Devastation Evoker, trying to get on him as soon as possible since his damage was really good. And, you know, using Ebb and Might again whenever we have like 4 seconds left, that's fine. Also, I have my Trinket here to use, so I'm going to throw out my Empowers to Upheaval, throw Prescience, and I can use this during the GCD, just like before. And just continue like this, right? We just want to make sure that we're keeping our Ebb and Might up as long as possible while also not losing charges of Prescience, making sure that we use it like right as it's about to cap. And then right before I go for my next Ebb and Might, what I'm going to do probably is try to use 2 Prescience, just like before, because I'm buffing all 4 targets this time, right? So both of those go out into the Ebb and Might, do the full charge Fire Breath into the Upheaval, and then just continue using my Essence Burst, my Essence, all that stuff. And I'm not going to be pressing this Prescience. I'm going to hold this Prescience until I'm about to hit 2 charges again. But this way, I'm lining things up better for my raid so that my raid is getting their damage amp right around 6 to 7 seconds in. That's probably going to be the most burst damage for your raid, but you will have to check again. You got to look at your logs. You got to see where people are bursting. You got to determine who is doing the most damage. These are things that are not true across different guilds or raid comps because player skill is a factor, gear is a factor, what class they're playing, what spec they're playing, even just like how they're playing that day, right? Could be a factor. Also the boss, what your strategy is. I mean, there's just like too many variables to go into each and every case. Just try to make a general deduction based off of your logs using the method I showed in this video. Okay, now let's talk about trinkets and how you would use them in your opener, because this is another variable you have to consider. So we are playing double on Eustace tier. What that means is that our best setup for trinkets involves using 2 on-use trinkets. Makes things complicated because whenever you use one trinket, you will incur a 20-second cooldown on the other trinket you have equipped. So you have to keep that in mind. So the best trinkets for us are going to be either Nymue Unraveling Spindle and the Belor Trinket off of Tendril. These 2 are going to be probably our best across the board, but then we also have another trinket that's fairly good over in Waycrest Manor. This is going to be the Bale Fire Branch, also a fantastic trinket. But in either case, the ideal combo is you're running either Bale Fire or you're using the Spindle and you're using it with the Belor Trinket. Okay. So Belor Trinket's easy to use because you pretty much just want to use it whenever it's available and you want to get that damage out and you don't want to lose any uses. So you can kind of put this one in the back seat and you can focus on making sure that you use your on-use trinket best. You saw in the previous example, I was using Balefire Branch with it and I would use my branch as soon as I landed from my Breath of Aeons. That's going to be generally the best way to use your on-use trinket. You want to use it basically to buff the window for your Breath of Aeons. You want to use it right there. So if you have Ashes of the Ember Soul, you're going to use it right after your Breath of Aeons. If you have Branch, you're going to use it right after your Breath of Aeons. If you have Mirror, you're going to use it right after your Breath of Aeons. You get the picture. Where this gets a little complicated is with the Nymue Spindle, because this thing actually requires you to channel it on your target for 3 full seconds. It's not just an instant casting. Okay, so in this example, I'm going to use Belor with the Spindle. Again, probably the best combo you're going to have is Branch plus Belor, but it depends on item level, and Spindle is one you can get from raids, so a lot of people are going to be running this setup right here. I begin to pull just like before, throw out my Living Flame. I'm going to buff my allies here. Going to throw out my Ebb and Might, and then I'm going to use my Spindle, let this thing fully channel. And then right here, I'm going to throw out my Breath of Aeons into the Tip the Scales, Fire Breath, Upheaval. This is where I'd also use my potion right away. Not going to drink one of those because it's on cooldown, but that's what I would do. And then just continue like normal. And this is going to line up really well for you because your Spindle will be up for every breath. And right here, I have the ability to use my Trinket. You can always fit this inside of a global cooldown. So I'm going to do the prescience here and use it at the same time. That way I don't lose any time there using that cast. Same deal as before though, want to make sure that we're buffing our allies as much as possible, keeping our Ebb and Might up. And we use 2 prescience right before it's time to use Ebb and Might, otherwise we can just send the 1. Okay, so in this example, I'm using the Spindle with the Branch. So the Branch is going to be the one that I use after my Breath of Aeons. Same deal as before, precast my Living Flame, throw out my 2 prescience, go into Ebb and Might. In this case, I'm going to delay just a little bit for my allies to get their buffs and their damage and all that stuff out. And then I'm going to hit that Breath of Aeons into the Balefire Branch, Potion, tip the scales on Fire Breath, use Upheaval. And then I'm just going to continue with my rotation until my Spindle is ready, which will be really soon here. It's coming up in 7 seconds. And once my Spindle is just about ready right here, okay, I'm going to go ahead and use the Spindle. Let that thing fully channel out. Ebb and Might is available again, so I'll throw this out too. I could also prescience another target if I wanted to make sure that I have all 4 targets buffed. It's kind of hard to just pretend because I don't have 4 targets to buff here at the target dummies, but you get the idea. Make sure you buff your prescience before you put out your Ebb and Might to assign it to the correct targets. And I get to enjoy this nice little mastery buff for a bit, and then Spindle's going to fall off. And after that, I'm pretty much just going to try to line up each and every one of my Balefire branches with my Breath of Aeons. And I'm going to try to make it so that I get some usage out of my Spindle, just kind of using it like mostly on cooldown. Or if there's ever like an opportunity where maybe there's like 1 minute classes have their cooldowns coming up, something like that, that might be a good place to use it as well. So again, the goal is just to make sure that you have the trinket up during the biggest damage window, which is your Breath of Aeons. If you don't have any of these trinkets, other ones aren't terrible. So like Pips is fine. You could use this with an on-use trinket. You could also use the trinket from Ataldazar the Vessel. This one's also decent as a passive, but the absolute best combo in most cases is going to be these two: Belor Trinket, Branch, or Belor Trinket with Spindle. So hopefully this gives you more context and you can start using this once you feel a little bit more comfortable with augmentation and once you're ready to try and match your breath window with your allies' damage actually reaching their full potential. But anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more of my content, be sure to subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell, and hopefully I see you in the next one.